Well, it's Labor Day weekend. That means what? It's the unofficial end of summer. That means all the seersucker goes back in the closet, right? I've managed to make it 48 years without seersucker. We'll see how long this goes. It means it's also the end of the vacation season. I know there's some folks out today, maybe you're watching this morning, taking that last gasp of vacation on this long weekend before we dive into the fall. This week, a young lady named Hannah Sampson wrote an article in the Washington Post, and she reflected on summer and Americans taking vacations. It was Wednesday, and this was the title of the article. It was, "What Does America Have Against Vacation?" Here's what she wrote. She said, "It's time to face a tough reality. America is not a great vacation nation." Here's what she says. "We're the only country out of the 36 wealthiest countries that don't guarantee vacation time for workers." The only one out of the 36 wealthiest nations in the world. And it's not just that. She says that even when Americans do get paid time off, they don't use it. As a nation, we take less vacation days today in 2019 than we did in the year 2000. And here's what's most telling. In 2018, listen to this, Americans left 768 million days of vacation unused, and 55% of Americans did not use all of their paid vacation time. Think about that for a second. How did you do with that this year? If you're retired, did you take any time away? If you're a student, did you take any time away? How did you do with that? Here's the thing. She's talking about vacation time, but I think really she's pointing to a much deeper issue that we have as Americans that's kind of woven into our culture. We are people who have this belief, this notion, this idea that we are what we do. We are our work. We are our productivity. We are what we can accomplish. We believe that we are our to-do list, or we are our calendar. We have this idea, we buy into this cultural notion, and then we get trapped in it, that we are the ability to do work. Just think about it. When you ask someone how they're doing, think about this. There are really only two answers that are acceptable, right? What are the two answers? The first one is, "I'm fine, everything's okay," right? What's the second answer that's acceptable in our world? "Man, I'm so busy," right? And the kids got me going all over the place. I feel like a taxi service for the kids. Oh my gosh, my schedule, work has been so crazy. You wouldn't believe it. One time a retiree even told me this. He said, "Man, Eddie, I am busier in retirement than I was when I was working," right? Even in retirement, we have this sense that we're supposed to prove ourselves by how busy we are, by what we're doing, what we're accomplishing in the world. I mean, if you ask somebody how they were doing and they said, "Kind of bored," right? I'm well rested today. What would you think? You'd think they were lazy. You'd think something was wrong with them, that they weren't accomplishing anything. We live in this world where we think labor is the way to life. We've given ourselves to this. And it's so odd on Labor Day for us to talk about this because Labor Day was initially established. Why? Because the unions had worked hard to break the power of work over us. But now how do we see Labor Day? We see it as this momentary, necessary pause in this work life that we all have. And somehow we know this isn't how we're supposed to live. There's this voice in us that cries out in us for rest, for stop, for something, for us to cease. 77% of Americans, listen, 77% of Americans say that they are constantly stressed, under constant anxiety. We know that the life that we've built, that we've bought into, is not a healthy life for us. In fact, there are all sorts of statistics and research about this. When we overwork like we tend to do, whether that's overwork at school, overscheduling with the kids, overwork at our jobs, we suffer, our health suffers, our marriages suffer, our relationships suffer, our families suffer. We become less. So how do we respond to that when we hear that? Some people just kind of shrug their shoulders, and maybe this is you, and you just dive back in and you think you can solve the riddle of life. If you work hard enough, you'll eventually get to that day of rest. Some people plan these great vacations where they get away. It's this fantastic vacation. Some people change jobs. Some people just throw themselves into the weekend. They really let go on the weekend. But what happens is when we get to the new job, when we get back from vacation, when the weekend is over, the exhaustion is still there, isn't it? It's still right there with us, eating at us. And we know the answer. We know we need rest. But here's, as followers of Jesus, as people of faith, it's not just that we need rest. It's that rest was written into our DNA. In the very creation of the world was this rhythm of work and rest that we were given. And in the New Testament, Jesus talks about Sabbath a lot. And typically when Jesus talks about Sabbath, he's talking about Sabbath because he's in conflict with the good religious people of his day. And the good religious people of his day have made Sabbath rest into this production. It's got all these layers of laws around it, what you can do, what you can't do, what is sin if you do it on the day of rest of Sabbath. And here's what Jesus does. He begins to give us a new understanding of the gift of Sabbath. There's a great story in Mark chapter 2. If you got your Bible, I want you to underline something in Mark chapter 2. And there's a story about Jesus and the disciples one Sabbath. It says, one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as the disciples, made their way, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. In other words, they're walking through a grain field. It's the Sabbath. They're grabbing the grains and they're eating them. Just a little snack there along the way. I'm sure you do that when you walk through a grain field, right? That's what they're doing. It seems to be pretty innocent, right? But the good religious people see it. In their minds, because of the way they have shaped Sabbath and the day of rest, they see that as sin. And so they ask Jesus, what are you going to do about this? Your disciples are sinning by plucking grains on the Sabbath. That's work. What are you going to do? And here's what Jesus says to them. This is verses 27 and 28. Then Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. We weren't made to follow laws to this human creation. Instead, Jesus says, the Sabbath, the day of rest, is a gift for us. And then at the end of that, he says, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. In other words, this gift that Jesus comes to give to us is given to us in Sabbath. So where does Sabbath even come from? The idea of Sabbath comes from the story of creation all the way back in Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 and 2, you remember it's the first story of creation, and I always call it the accountant's story of creation because everything has a place and it's very orderly. And in that story, there's this day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, and all of these days, God looks at what's created and says it's good. And then the seventh day, the peak of creation. What do we get at the peak of creation? I want to read Genesis 2, verses 2 through 4 for you. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. That meant he made it holy, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. Think about that. The very peak, the height of creation is not more work. What's the peak of creation? Sabbath rest. Sabbath, the word itself, doesn't just mean rest. It means to cease or to stop. So why would God want to create this day of rest, of ceasing, of stopping? Is it because God is worn out and God is tired? Maybe. But here's what one rabbi says. He wrote this several centuries ago. Rabbi Elijah of Vilna. God stopped to show us that what we create becomes meaningful to us only once we stop creating it and start to think about why we did so. Day 7, the peak of creation, is the day that all of creation catches up to God. And God remembers the goodness of all of it. And here's the interesting thing that happens in the Old Testament, is that God invites us into the gift, into the holiness of Sabbath rest so that we can have a moment, a day where all that has been can catch up to us, where the truth and the meaning of life can finally catch up to us. Here's the commandments. Exodus 20, that's where God gives Moses the 10 commandments, right? You remember some of the commandments? We'll test you. Do not kill, steal, lie, have affairs, honor your mother and father. You remember, don't have idols. There's only one God. These are the 10 commandments. We know them, right? So, and they're the things that they're kind of the bedrock for community. This is what life can be for us and for others. But right in the middle, the fourth commandment is the commandment to rest. Let me read it for you. Exodus 20, starting with verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. God invites us into this meaningful day of rest where things can catch up with us. And here's the interesting thing about the fourth commandment. It is the longest and most detailed of all of the commandments. You'd think God would want to spend more time on murder, right? Or not lying, or honoring your parents, all right? That's where God would want to invest the energy. But instead, it's as if God says, look, I know that you're going to know not to murder, have affairs, steal, lie. I know you're going to know all that. But this moment of rest is so significant that I want to make sure I line it out for you, that I detail it for you so you don't miss the meaning of this, that you need to cease, that you need to stop. And often when we think about Sabbath, we just think about this day where we can lay on the sofa and we watch football, or we can watch a movie, or we can catch up on chores around the house. But Sabbath is something different. Here's what Sabbath is. Sabbath is a radical reorientation of life. Here's what Sabbath does for us. Sabbath breaks the cycle of work. What Sabbath does for us is it says to us, you are not your work. You are not what you have accomplished. You are not your lengthy to-do list. You are not your calendar. You are not all of the things that you think make up your life. You are defined not by what you do. You are defined by what you are, and you are a child of God. What Sabbath does is it allows us just for a minute to step off of the crazy train of work and allow all the goodness of God to catch up with us, and to remember that we belong to God. It's an act of faith at one level. Because it's an act of faith, because we have to trust that the world won't keep spinning because of our work. The world will keep spinning because of the work of God, and we can rest in the hands of God. We can't fix everything. What Sabbath does, Sabbath reminds us that we are limited, right? We're limited. But the God who loves us is a limitless God. That's what Sabbath offers to us. It reorients our life away from all of the demands and all the pull of work and stuff to accomplish and a calendar to follow, so that we can remember we are simply because we are. So what does it mean to take Sabbath? How do we do it? And I think we have to have maybe some help with this. Because here's how invasive work is. Even at times now, when we try to pull away from work, what happens? Work finds us. I think back to my dad. If he had to go do work for his job, he had to physically go back to work. But what do we do now? Where does work find us? At home, on our phones, on our laptops. Work finds us. So if we're going to create space for rest and Sabbath, if we're going to take up this practice of rest, and we've got to work at it some, believe that sounds crazy, right? But we've got to begin to set some boundaries in our lives. So let me give you a couple ways to set those boundaries. Here's the first thing I'd tell you. Define what work is for you and then don't do it. Doesn't that sound ridiculous? But I think we have to say that. Define what work is for you and then don't do it. If your work is staying inside all the time behind a desk, then maybe Sabbath rest for you is being outside, being active, walking, playing with the kids, playing with the neighborhood kids, doing something beyond just seeing four walls. If work for you is being tied to texting and emails, then maybe Sabbath for you involves the airplane mode on your phone. If work for you is being constantly creative, then maybe Sabbath for you is true quiet. If work for you is simply being isolated alone in a cubicle, then maybe Sabbath rest for you is being with friends and family and kind of giving yourself over to that. Define what work is for you and then don't do it. That might be hard. You may need to actually spend some time considering this. The next thing I tell you that I would encourage you to do is block out your Sabbath time. Pull up your phone, or if you've still got, if you're a Luddite and you still have a paper calendar in this world, block out your Sabbath. Go ahead and outline it, color it out, put an X on it, whatever you need to do, so that when you look at your calendar, you know that's your Sabbath. My Sabbath obviously can't be Sundays, but my Sabbath is Monday. And so on my calendar, I'm out. Eddie's out is what it says on my calendar on Mondays. Now, that doesn't mean that sometimes I don't get called in, that there aren't things I have to deal with. But I know as a rule, Monday is my day. What if you did that? Maybe it can't be Sunday for you. Maybe it's Saturday for you. Or maybe it's big blocks of time at other times during the week where you do the things that break you out of the cycle and the trap of the work life that we have. Block out your Sabbath. And here's the other thing that I would tell you to do about keeping Sabbath, practicing rest, is let others help you. Let other people know in your life, hey, Sunday, this is what I want my Sundays to be. This is how I want my Sundays to look. This is what Sabbath is for me. Let your spouse know, let a friend know. If you've got a Sunday school class or a small group, maybe let them know. Maybe help each other. Maybe in your group of friends, when you ask, hey, how are you doing? You retrain your group of friends to say, oh, well, this week, it's been a great week because on Sunday, I spent the whole day outside with friends and family. Or maybe it's that check-in with a spouse or a friend. How'd you do with Sabbath this week? When did you take rest this week? When I became the lead pastor at Parkway Heights in 2006, I had 2 young daughters. One was 5, one was 3. my very first staff parish meeting. Staff parish is the committee that's my boss. And at the very first staff parish meeting, I'm ready to run. I've got all these plans. I got all this stuff we're going to do. And the chair of staff parish looked at me and he said this, Eddie, you need to know that the church has been here long before you got here. It'll be here long after you leave. But you have 2 daughters that you get one chance to raise. He was encouraging me to take the time that I need Sabbath and rest with family. He knew how consuming the church could be. And when he would see me in the years after that, he would ask me about that. I saw him a couple of weeks ago. I had to go back to Hattiesburg for something. You know what he asked me? How are the girls? Not how you are, not how my wife is, not how the job is. How are the girls, Eddie? He held me accountable. He helped me find people who can help you. And here's what I know some of you are thinking. Some of you are sitting there thinking, Eddie, I got that, but this season of life is so crazy. I'm finishing up my PhD. I've just opened a business. It's this season for work. I just took a new job, and it's crazy right now. Eddie, I'm taking care of my mom or my dad right now, and it's just consuming me. I go from work to there, and I get it. There are seasons in life. There are seasons in life where regular Sabbath is an impossibility. So I don't want you to hear me giving you a lot of guilt today. There are seasons in life where it is impossible. And if you're in one of those seasons, then I would encourage you to do one of 2 things. One, really block out some time somewhere in your week, even if it's an hour or 2. But here's the other thing I would encourage you to do. Look forward, project forward. Maybe it's 6 months from now. Maybe it's 8 months from now. Maybe it's a year from now that you go ahead and put on your calendar. Start Sabbath again. And then invite someone else to put that on their calendar for you. Eddie starting Sabbath again. So that when you get to that day, you can check in. You can have someone helping you get to that. Because here's the thing. Once you get in the habit of work, what happens? It's hard to break free. It's hard to release that life. So have other people help you. Your health and your wellness, the wellness, I think, of our world even, of our culture, I think requires us to reestablish the rhythm and the practice of rest in our lives. When I was growing up, not an athlete, I know that's surprising for some of you. But I loved to swim. Swimming was my thing. We had a pool in the backyard, and I'd swim back and forth all day long in the pool. And the idea of swimmers, I'd watch the Olympics, or I'd watch the national meets, and I'd absorb things, and I'd watch how they entered the water, how they turned, all these things. No swim team in my small town. This was just Eddie being crazy, right? Except once a year, we'd go to scout camp, Camp Wilkes in Biloxi, Mississippi. At scout camp, they would have a swim meet. It's a great swim meet. It's my single opportunity during the year. And there were real swimmers that showed up for the swim meet. They'd show up to the swim meet, scout swim meet, with their little Speedos and their swim caps on. Really kind of creepy for me. I'd go stand up there with them. In the first year, the whistle blows, I go in the water, we all go in the water. Get down to the first turn, I'm headed back, and I realize everyone in the water is still swimming at me. I'm way in the lead. So I swim harder. Eddie, you're going to do this. Get about halfway back to the finish line, and all of a sudden alarms start going off in my head, my chest starts cramping up, and suddenly, involuntarily, I lurched out of the water. Why? I hadn't been breathing at all. And by the time I got things back together, everyone had passed me and had reached the finish line before me. Here's what happens. If you don't take on the practice of rest, at some point involuntarily, your body will force you to take that rest. So finish strong. Build in the times where you can simply breathe in and breathe out, where you can remember that you are not your work. You are not a bunch of productivity. You are not your calendar. You are a child of God. And there's a rhythm of life for you in this season and in every season of life. So let's pray this morning about how we might begin to take on this meaningful practice. God, life comes at us, whether it's the demands of family or work or other things that we've committed to. And God, it's easy for us simply to begin to let the work, rest, balance get out of whack. To listen to the whispers of our world. There's more for you to do. There's more for you to accomplish. You are what you do. But may Sabbath rest remind us that we're not what we do. We are yours. Period. End of story. And may the long-term practice of rest bring health to us and our families and our communities. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.